share this. There we go. That's why we're going to be recording this and sharing this with our community for folks who weren't able to attend this evening. And so today the discussion is gender creative parenting, and this is through the lens of LGBTQ families, but we think everyone can learn from the experiences of our speakers today. We really wanted to open this up to families all across the US, different family structures, and people who were approaching gender creative parenting in a lot of different ways. So as each of you joining us may have varying levels of awareness of what gender creative parenting is, what it may look like in practice, what the various advantages are, much like all styles of parenting, gender creative parenting varies so much depending on the family. For some, it simply means, stripping expectations and labels about what boys or girls should be doing. For others, it's a real deep exploration into the opportunity to expose your family to every type of experience with equal footing so that your kiddos can experience life with as little of these social expectations and judgments of how they should look, how they should behave, just based on what they were assigned as birth. So we brought in some amazing speakers. I'd love to just give each of these speakers a chance to briefly introduce themselves, what their family looks like, and what gender creative parenting means to them, or kind of like how they quickly define it to friends or family or people who ask what they think gender creative parenting is. So let's toss it over to Shannon.
Hi, I'm Shannon Shivers. I am a first-time mom. I was a gestational parent, and my trans wife and I had our kid in June, so they're 5 months now. And it's just the three of us and our 2 cats. And actually, before we had the baby, we got the 2 cats in the year beforehand and decided to use they, them pronouns for them exclusively as well. And it was a great way to get in the practice of using those as kind of a default. And I use she, her pronouns, as does my wife. And we are joining from Corvallis, Oregon on traditional Kalapuya land.
Awesome.
I forgot.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I was supposed to say how we define it, huh? So the way we're doing gender creative parenting is not so much gender neutral as it is making sure that our kid feels comfortable with whatever gender identity is right for them. And that way, because we know genitals don't determine gender identity, and there are non-binary genitals as well in terms of like intersex and also just general sex characteristics. So we say like we're going to let them decide, but I want them to feel comfortable being any gender. So we allow all pronouns or kind of framings of their gender until they're able to articulate their preference.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. Caden?
Hi, all. It's lovely to be with you all tonight. My name is Caden. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm on Listiana Loney lands in Oakland, California, and very similar to Shannon, kind of what I have a 4.5-year-old who at the moment is defining as non-binary, and I have a 4-month-old that you may have seen in the call, but they were way too chatty to stay in this room while I was talking, and my 4.5-year-old, I'm sure I'll get into it, but they have kind of gone through a few different iterations of how they identify and what pronouns they want. And for us, like, we're really very similar to Shannon. We've used they, them. We've specifically chosen they, them just because we found it's easier a little bit for someone to just have one pronoun to go with, but very similar to Shannon, like if they were alternating between all of them when the kids are kind of in the anti-gender, like the pre-gender period, that would be equally valid. And we chose gender creative parenting for a variety of reasons, but I feel like ultimately just as we would want our kids to be able to explore their interests in art or in science or in what they do in the forest or in what they want to wear or what TV shows they like or how they want to style their hair, like any version of autonomy that we want to give our kids, we see gender in the exact same way. So we don't want to assume or have anything assumed onto our kids ahead of time, ahead of them kind of getting to explore on their own. So really wanting to give them the freedom in gender as well as any other area in their life. So that's kind of the foundation that we're trying to bring in. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Lauren.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I am in San Francisco on traditional Ramaytush Ohlone lands. And I live here in this house you see behind me with my partner, Austin, who uses he, him, our 2.5-year-old who is anti-gender, and we use they, them pronouns for our kiddo, and our fluffy little dog who doesn't really care what pronouns he uses because he's a dog. And I'm pretty sure animals don't have genders. So for us, gender creative parenting means really what has been said already, frankly. It means allowing our kiddo to experiment and explore gender. It means gender expansiveness. It means, being able to wear whatever and play with whatever and experiment with whatever. And it's really interesting because we are just on the verge, but not quite there, of some level of gender awareness at 2.5 years old. And it's starting to change some of the conversations that we have at home and that we have with other caregivers and things like that.
That's so cool. Yeah, we are going to definitely talk about what it's like when your child starts to articulate their gender or gender identity or anything in that sort of realm. I think that's a really interesting time. And that's also a lot of what people who look into gender creative parenting are curious about, like what happens when there is that expression of now I have these thoughts and ideas and feelings about who I am. So I think that's really awesome. I want to kind of go through your all journey almost chronologically. So maybe the best way to start is, folks build their families in a lot of different ways. Maybe you thought about gender creative parenting before conception or before building your family. So who here had the thought of gender creative parenting before you even had your child or before, your child was an entity in the real world? And do you want to talk about what those conversations were with yourself, your partner, your family, when those conversations started? Who would like to share?
So when I was in high school, I took a psych class and they reviewed the differences between gender and sex and that sort of thing. And when I was in that class, there was an article we read about baby X who was raised with no gender, and it was this social experiment. And I was really entranced by it and was like, yeah, this would be great. Like, get rid of the gender stereotypes and let them just be them. And but it was kind of the like, but also, are they messing up this kid because they're the only one like this? And so I always liked the idea of it, but didn't necessarily feel that it was practical yet. And then in 2018, my best friend has their oldest child came out as non-binary and is now identifying more as like demi-boy. And around that same time, or within like the year, my partner came out as a trans woman. And so, that had me reflecting a lot on gender and kind of my thoughts on it, as well as my sexuality kind of became more of an exploration with that situation. And I often found myself thinking like, it'd be a lot easier if she was non-binary instead of a woman. And like, why do we have to have these gender stereotypes and be a woman anyway? And then it's like, well, I'm not changing how I'm identifying. So like, is that fair? And then also kind of thinking through gender in terms of what I appreciated about her was that she never fit any gender stereotypes anyway, and that can be true regardless of how she's identifying. And then I also had my first non-binary coworker and friend that year who I got along with really well. So it went from like this really abstract idea to like a concrete, like these are real people. And I told my friends like, hey, I think this is what I'm going to be doing. And they'd be like, but think about your kid in kindergarten when they go and they're told like boys over here and girls over here. And then I was just kind of like, okay. And then my kid can be in solidarity with any intersex kid who is like, oh, well, that doesn't fit me in any way, shape, or form. And my partner originally was kind of like, oh, well, we can just be like, if they decide that they're not the gender that matches what they'd be assigned, we'll just be really supportive and welcoming. Because she is very attached to her gender as a trans woman. It's a very important part of her identity. But the more kind of we talked about it and she got used to the idea that it wasn't so much that I wasn't allowing people to identify how they wanted, but more of just making sure that genuinely all the options are supported really fairly. And so that's why I'm fine with any pronouns at all. And we actually, unlike many parents in this group, perhaps, we conceived using IVF. And so we actually knew very early on the chromosomes of the baby. And I was very clear to ask when they would tell us, and I would say, okay, you're using these terms, but like, I know chromosomes are more complicated than that. Like, what were they actually? So we know, multiple biological factors, but again, that doesn't speak to gender identity and how it's such a construct in our society. And so we decided to do that from the very beginning, to just go for it, telling the doctors and all of that right from the start that we were going to be not using their assigned sex at birth. And actually living in Oregon, we were able to make the gender marker an X on their birth certificate, which is interesting. There was actually a couple options we could choose for that. One was the X, and there was one that was like unknown. And I was like, can I have that one? And they were like, we don't really know what that one is. Like, no, don't. That'll be difficult. Like everyone I asked, no one knew. And I was like, well, that's really what I want. Like, I don't want to be telling them what theirs is. So that was kind of a fascinating little piece there. Maybe by the next kids, I'll have learned more about if that's realistic or not. But in Oregon, people are allowed to have X on their driver's license and identification at whatever age.
That's awesome. Does anyone else want to share kind of those early, either pre-conception or pregnancy or whatever your situation was?
Sure, I can go ahead. So my partner and I remember this slightly differently. So I'm going to tell you my version. So we had heard of people not choosing to assign their child a gender before we had actually conceived. That it was something that we were aware of and definitely were thinking about as a possibility already. And this is the part where my partner would tell you we had decided before we conceived. And I don't think we had fully decided, but I do remember the moment when it solidified for me, and I think it also solidified for my partner. We did early genetic testing, and we chose to discover the chromosomes. And we opened up that email, and it said, it's insert gender, assumed gender based on chromosomes here, exclamation point. It didn't say XX or XY. It said like assume gender. And there was just, the two of us looked at this together, and then we were just sitting there dumbfounded and deeply sad, not because we were upset about like, you know, which one of the two options it chose, but because it had that option. It filled in that blank with a gender rather than biological information. And within about 2 days of that, we had like settled. This is what we're doing. We're not going to assign our child a gender. We're going to give them all the options that we can. And started reaching out and finding community. And I was really glad to have found, there's a Facebook group that a lot of us are in, to have found this community to start asking questions and getting to know others who are doing the same before when our kid was still itty bitty in utero.
Thank you. Caden?
Yeah, just to add on briefly, we also, my partner, Eli, is also on the call now. And the two of us, I feel like knew very early on, like when we were talking about having kids, similar to Lauren and Shannon, of wanting to engage in this kind of parenting. And just one thing that hasn't been said is I feel like I feel like exploring my gender. Like I identify as genderqueer, non-binary, or like insert any other term of kind of like what else is kind of in between, or what combination. Like I feel like I'm still exploring my gender identity. And I was just thinking, oh, like if I was born in like the 80s, like this wasn't an option necessarily, like this wasn't done. But had that been an option, or had that been a norm, I just feel like, oh, like I'm so curious, like how would things have explored, or like what would that have been like? And then we can get into this more when we talk about what it's like raising kids in school level age. But just watching my oldest kid having this experience and having these options, this language to it, and their classmates who maybe don't have like a clear gender that they fall into and that they identify with, but being like, it's a non-issue, that like my kid is identifying as non-binary. It's just like so freeing to watch. So I feel like those are the conversations that my partner and I had before we were even trying to have kids. And it's lovely to watch how it's playing out.
Oh, thank you. I love to hear that people are seeing kind of a new generation where it is it can be, and it often is a non-issue, which I really love to hear. I'm curious how folks started to communicate either before their child was in this world or very early on, how you communicated to others, whether it's your family or friends, or as you mentioned, like healthcare providers. And how did you talk about the way that you're raising your child, and how did you answer questions, or kind of, can you give people an insight on what those conversations felt or looked like? Kaden, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start this one. So with both of our kids, we didn't find out the sex. We did like very little testing of anything on our kids when I was pregnant. And we were just really upfront with our doctors right from the start. And like every ultrasound, we kind of were like, we don't want to know the sex. Like, please don't tell us. Please tell me when I should look away. Not that I could really make anything out on the ultrasound anyway, but like, they're just like, no, like just look away at this point. And still on like the medical side, when we were giving birth, we also were very clear with the doctors and the midwives at our hospital that were like, please don't tell us, please don't announce like when the baby's born, like let us hold the baby, let us be with the baby for a little bit, and then we'll choose to look when we want to look. Like we kind of wanted just to soak in being with this little human just as a human and not putting anything on it, because even though we're going into this wanting to be gender creative and gender neutral, we're still coming with our own socialization and our own conditioning. And like as much as we want to not have like knowing what the baby's sex is, not have that impact our view at all, it could, because we're breathing the air that's all around us. So that was important to us. And being in the Bay Area in California, that we never got any pushback really. For family, it was very easy because we didn't know the sex. So it's not like we could like withhold it from them because we just didn't know when we were pregnant. And I feel like that kind of prepped things. Like we automatically used they for them because we didn't know, they were just a little baby inside. And like once you got past those questions of like, wait, are you having twins? Like they, like once you get past that, then it's just like, oh, there's no other language you can use really. So I feel like that was an entry for a lot of our family members that maybe weren't as familiar with this, into kind of what they would use. And yeah, I'll pause there.
Awesome. Anyone else want to share any early conversations with outside folks?
Sure, I can go ahead. So we were on the other end of the spectrum. I'm a biologist. I was like, I want to know all the things about my child's biology. So when we were very clear with our doctors that we were not going to assign a gender, and they put it in the charts. And like, it's still in my child's chart today that they do not have an assigned gender, to the point where like we went to the emergency room a couple of weeks ago for an issue directly related to my child's genitals, and everybody who actually looked at their chart used they them pronouns for my child, and it was amazing. And we're in San Francisco, so everyone was really understanding, and like did their best during our 20-week ultrasound. We told, it was actually a doctor doing the ultrasound. We told them that we want them to describe the anatomy that they're seeing and not assign any gender terms, and they were awesome. And that's exactly what they did. And like, they described my child's genitals the same way they described my child's brain, and it was super cool. And with a family, and we started having early conversations that were tailored to the people that we were talking to. So for example, my partner's family, we just sort of sat down and told them like, this is what we're doing and why. And we ended up having an hour-long conversation on the validity of the singular they. But other than that, like, they were super supportive and awesome. My family, we sort of eased them into it by saying things like, when they would answer like, are you going to find out their gender? And like, no, we don't know their gender. Like, just saying very truthful statements, and then like dropping little bits about like our theory of gender. And I've had a lot of conversations with my parents over time about my theory of gender that they don't fully understand. So like, it wasn't totally a shock that when we sent them and our siblings an email that had a lot of details about the choice that we were making to not assign a gender, what that means in terms of like gender expansiveness, and what it doesn't mean in terms of gender neutrality, how they can support us, and open the door for questions and conversations. And so from there, it was, my parents still had to take some time to digest and like asked some questions, but they were really receptive. And so it was almost everyone else in our community, because here in the Bay Area, everyone is lovely.
Lovely. Shannon, do you have anything to add?
Yeah.
Being the non-Bay Area person.
Well, so I grew up in Davis, California, and my parents were lesbian. So a lot of my community and environments have already had to be relatively accepting broadly in terms of LGBT issues. Also with my partner being trans. So that wasn't too bad. The bigger challenge for me was actually, going to any parenting classes pre-baby. Like, they would, in their language, be really gendered about like he or she or things like that, or any like the apps, they'll default. There was one app I was going to try and use for tracking that once the baby was born, it was like, okay, now you have to put in M or F. And I was like, fine, I won't use your app. And so there was kind of Those pieces that were hard. And one of the classes we were in, it was also kind of a good litmus test to say, like, am I in a safe space, right? So like Lauren was saying, all of those spaces, you know, you kind of knew, okay, these people are okay, and I can kind of let my guard down a little bit. One of the classes we went to, and we were able to get a partial refund and did not go to more. The host initially said, like, and you can share their gender if you want to, but then when people were going around, she was like asking, and what's their gender, and what, you know, and so there was a family who went before us that said, oh, we don't know yet, and we're like, we'll just stick with that. Like, yep, we don't know yet, like, that's true. And then it doesn't invite more questions, and it was pretty easy in that regard. And then we told the doctor early, you know, that we were going to be doing this, and folks still have a really hard time. I'm actually really surprised at the doctor's office too. Like, I know it's in the notes there, we have X on their birth certificate and everything, but they still kind of struggle. And so I'm pretty on top of like making sure that we're reminding them when it's those circumstances. But with strangers, I don't really worry about it too much, because, you know, one day they're wearing blue and they're saying he, and another day they're wearing pink and they're saying she. And it's like, okay, well, then you'll get a good kind of balance over time. One of the things that I thought a lot about going in was how we use boy and girl as like shorthand for imagining what the person might be like personality wise when they grow up. And so I made a few different sheets. And could I do a screen share and just show real quick? With that, I know how. Okay with you.
Perfect, please do.
So I made this little gender FAQ that I posted on social media for everyone in my family to kind of know that this is what we were doing. And I linked, so this one's underlined because it's a hyperlink. There's a really great article that kind of goes into details. And I went through and I was like, okay, this is what gender is. This is what sex is. Addressing any questions in terms of, you know, how we're going to interpret it, what they can call the kid, addressing the concern, like, won't that make things harder for them? And being like, and it could also make things harder for your kid if you don't do it this way, right? Like, how they identify. And then, you know, really wanted this last point to be clear that, like, I'm not putting my kid in a bunch of gray clothes because colors have no gender. So like, don't, like, why can't everyone wear flowers? That's silly. So this was kind of the starting place that we sent to everyone, family and everything. And then I also made a few different like kind of game type things for the baby showers, where instead of fixating on, oh, do you think they'll be a boy or a girl? It'd be, okay, what do you think their favorite school subject will be? What kind of preferences will they have? I did one. So again, just guessing more based on like physical, like which parent are they gonna look more like? And then I did kind of this circle an option about what you think they'll like to do, right? And so really divorcing things like makeup and robotics from gender in this case.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of fun making those, and I think it also just helped people to kind of feel excited about it and less weird about it. And then we also had I wrote a big poster for our delivery room that said my pronouns, my partner's pronouns, you know, and then any notes about the baby. And that seemed to work pretty well in terms of that process. And then when they were born, we also told the people, like the lactation consultants or the nurses, sometimes they would get really flustered and embarrassed if they used the assigned gender. And so telling them like, oh, it's okay, you can use that one, just also use other ones too. It seemed to relieve a lot of the pressure for them, which was nice. So we haven't had a ton of pushback yet, which is great.
That is really awesome to hear. And I love how creative you got with some of the baby shower stuff, because as somebody who now has a 1-year-old, I didn't realize how gendered the whole like baby industry was. I feel like it is more gendered than at any other time in a person's life. Like there is an obsession with, if you're having a boy or girl, number one question that people have to ask, especially like if they don't know you, and I don't know how it impacts them in any way whatsoever, and the kind of adjectives that they want to use to describe your child. And so that's kind of what I'm really curious about, is kind of this anti-gender phase. So like 0 to maybe 3 or 4 years old, when kids start to verbalize what they identify as or how they feel in that moment, in that span of time. How were you making sure or providing more equity and providing more options and choices and really creating kind of like an equal playing field for your kiddos, shopping both aisles, using different adjectives? Like, what does it look like a day in the life of gender parenting an anti-gender kiddo?
I can go first here. So, I mean, the first and most obvious thing and the easiest way for most of us to express ourselves is clothing, right? And that's, everybody's first question is like, what does your kid wear? I have to admit that I am a little biased because obviously I do the shopping, and my partner does the shopping too. Like the two of us are really biased, and we really like rainbows and stars and stuff like that, and so like, and bright colors. So we probably index a little more on things that come from the girls aisle, just because it's fun. But we do try to actively sort of shop both aisles, and we provide a plethora of options, and we try to always give like our kiddo at least two options, because it's a toddler. If you have more than like 2 to 3 options, they're overwhelmed and then nothing ever happens. But we try to like be somewhat equitable or like random as we're pulling things out of the closet, to not necessarily like present a girl option versus a boy option for a shirt every morning, but just to be like, oh, it seems like you're in a robot mood today. Here are 2 robot shirts for you to choose from. Or are you in a robot mood or a rainbow mood? Which, by the way, those are my kiddos' favorite things: robots, rainbows, stars, and flowers. I think that's unicorns. I missed unicorns. So like the clearly like their interests are quite expansive of what is typical, like gender typical. And it's just really fun, like as we're getting to the stage where they care about what they're wearing, and like one day they'll be like, oh, I want to dress like daddy, and they'll like pull out like this masculine-ish plaid shirt, and then they'll put on like the red sparkle pants with it, and then a pink jacket over top. And it's for me, the hardest part is like the red pants and the pink jacket clashing, but yes, it drives me nuts. But it's really fun because we haven't limited them in clothes. And the same goes with toys. Like they love their bright pink stroller just as much as they love their Duplos and Magnetiles, and pretend tool set. And just like and at school, like they're known to be always carrying a baby doll around. So it's just, it's really fun to see how they are clearly not putting themselves in a box yet.
Yes, I love that. I love when kids don't feel like they can't do something because it's for X gender, or they can't do something because of what someone in their class would think or their sibling would think or what have you. Does anyone else want to share? Or even, I'm also curious how you communicate, in daycare settings or playgroup settings, to be like, hey, in our family, we don't say that that's just for girls or just for boys, or like, what are those conversations looking like?
I was just gonna say on the gendering front, one of the things that it really changed for me was privacy around my kiddos' genitals. I'm more of like, everyone could be naked and that would be fine with me. But I know that we are so programmed like to think of people in that way. So both of my parents and one of my in-laws and, all the rest of the family, they don't know what genitals my kid has, which means that we have to be a little bit more like careful about where we're changing them or things like that. Some of my friends know because they also have kids, and so it makes it easier to talk about like, oh, what's it like when you're changing them or things like that, or what decisions are you making? But it really, I think, has helped a lot in what people gender and the words they use to describe them. And then I'll say, my kids being raised by two women, and, we tend to like more feminine things. So they end up in more feminine clothes. But I also really think about it in terms of any of the boyfriends I ever had would more or less be fine wearing any of the clothes I'd put my kids in. And of course, most women I know would be fine wearing anything from the boys section in terms of like, most women wear pants, most women wear blue stripes. And so like a lot of times the women's clothes feel genderless to me in a way that the men's clothes just seem like they're much more limited in what they're allowed to wear. So that's kind of been a big shift there for me.
Now, some of you have kids who have kind of reached that age where maybe they're starting to express what their gender identity is, or what they think it is, or what it is in that moment. What have those conversations been like, or how do you navigate communicating with them to other people that maybe they've changed their pronouns or they've changed how they want to identify?
Yeah, I can start with this one. So I feel like in some ways it felt hard that first year of like, oh, like people are always asking you, or like strangers doing this or strangers doing that and wondering. But I feel like it ramped up, like the amount you have to advocate for your kid ramped up when they started going into daycare and going into school in a way that I just didn't think through. So all of the caregivers or all of our kids have been Spanish speaking, and we actually put our now 4.5-year-old, they started preschool when they were 2, and they go to a Spanish speaking preschool, and it's like a forest school and very hippie and very progressive, but it's all in Spanish, and there's starting to be, and Latinx communities are starting to have a lot more gender neutral language. But at least a couple of years ago, it wasn't as widespread. So that was tricky to explain to the teachers of like, okay, can you just switch? Can you just go back? Can sometimes use ella, sometimes use, sorry, I don't know how to speak much Spanish, so that might have been the wrong pronouns, but like, can you just switch between pronouns? And that mostly worked. I think my 4.5-year-old presents more feminine, even though that's not, they're identified as non-binary, so that doesn't fit their pronoun, but most of the teachers just use AF for them, the she pronoun for them. And we've asked our kid if they want us to correct them, and they don't really care. They care in English. Like if they can tell, if they hear someone use he or she in English, they definitely want it corrected. But they don't seem to care in Spanish as much. And then one story I'll share in terms of like, how do you know when your kid has a preference kind of thing? At like right before the pandemic, our kids started to prefer she more and like be wanting to use she, but they kind of like would go in all sorts. It's like one day their pronoun would be she, one day their pronoun would be unicorn, one day their pronoun would be they, one day their pronoun would be like the color purple. Like it was just constantly changing. They were playing with it, which is great, and we encouraged it, and it was just like we just went through it. But when we were talking about them, our kid, we still use they, because it's like, oh, they're just like switching back and forth. Like they'll once they settle on one, we'll switch. But right now we'll just use they. And they had been using she, I guess, consistently, but it didn't click that it was so consistent. And then one time, it was, now the pandemic had hit, everything is Zoom calls, and we were just on like a social gathering thing, and we were going around sharing our names and sharing pronouns. And I introduced our kid. It's like, oh, this is my kid's name. And we use they, them pronouns. And my kid stopped being like, Mama, I've told you, I use she. Like, I like was very clear, like little 3-year-old, like very clear, use she for me. And like the people that know us on the Zoom call were just like cracking up, but like, okay, like, there we go. So they used she for about a year. And then, yeah, about like 5 or 6 months ago, they went back to they, and now they're they, and they're saying, no, I'm non-binary, and are very clear about it. So I feel like when they really care about it, they advocate for themselves, and when they hear that people are not using the wrong one, they say it, and that's what we're hoping for. Yeah,
That's great. They are empowered to use their voice. So that's exactly what you want all of your kids to feel. Anyone else have anything to share about that?
Yeah, this isn't so much about my kids' self-identity, but sort of understanding their cultural context, because at 2.5, my kiddo definitely doesn't have a concept of their own gender. But I can definitely see among some of their peers, they have an idea, their peers have ideas of gender markers. So I remember one of my good friends, their child speaks German, and I remember the first time they called me a Frau, and I was like, same exact age as my kid, 2.5. And I was like, whoa, your kid like identifies that I am female, or that I present as female. And that was just really startling. And then I'm starting to notice my kids' other peers like saying man, woman, etc. My child does not. The only gender markers the only way that they seem to be like showing that they have gender markers or see gender markers on other people is they'll differentiate between mommy and daddy, because I do go by mommy and my partner goes by daddy. And they've generalized that. But other than that, like everyone is a person. Right now, everyone's a kiddo. They also don't sort of clearly understand age markers, but they never say like that boy, that girl, whereas I do hear their peers saying things like that. And my kiddo, like, they're just starting to be able to use pronouns, and like they use first person pronouns and second person pronouns appropriately. And 80% of the time for third person pronouns, they're using they and them. And it's just really cool to see that, like, at this young age, when their peers are projecting gender onto other people, my child is not. And I think it's because we've really modeled that for them.
That's very cool. I want to open up for questions, but I do want to kind of pose one maybe kind of a catch-all question here, especially since the lens of this is a lot of LGBTQ families. I'm curious if any of you have, through the experience of gender creative parenting, reflected on your own gender or the parental name that you chose, and is there a conversation with your kiddo about like any changes in you or your co-parent, and how those things evolve when you're having these types of conversations? I guess sort of my last comments led on to this a little bit. Like, I do go by mommy, my partner goes by daddy. And I all my life have presented as rather feminine as I was assigned. But I think we can all relate internally to like whether you identify as cis, trans, non-binary, or whatever, to the idea of not
relating to some aspect of those gender stereotypes. And through this process, and a lot through my partner who like actually studied gender studies, I have just developed the idea that gender is, I know a lot of trans people will disagree with this, but like for me, the idea of gender is performance. And I have come to a place where like it's important for me to make space for the fact that like I never felt truly like feminine inside, and that I've started like professionally using they them pronouns also, and it's really because I put so much critical thought into what gender is and what gender means for my child that I'm beginning to like have these realizations too.
Yeah, I think very similar. Doing that, like I went into gender creative parenting like knowing that I was queer, knowing that I was gender fluid or non-binary, but I wasn't super out about it. Like I didn't correct people's pronouns. I didn't correct people when they misgendered me all that much. I just like combination of just not, I don't know, like not wanting to rock the boat or just not knowing how to do it, not being comfortable. And like I was much more also worried about, like I kept my hair really short and I made sure I had like the queer aesthetic so I could be seen and be visible. And like I cared about that stuff a lot more. And through this process and having to kind of explain to our kid, because they'll be like, well, mama, like how do I know if I'm going to be a boy or a girl or something else? Like how will I know? And coming to the language of like, what brings you joy? Like, what do you feel good in? Like, what do you feel most confident in? When you're deciding this, you starting to then put your lens on this, where it's like, oh, like long hair is kind of fun, and hair doesn't have a gender. So like you can have long hair and be non-binary, and that's cool. Like where so many of the things that we see are kind of like gender fluid or gender queer people have this certain androgynous look and like different things like that, where it can be more open. So I feel like in this process I've felt more comfortable than exploring the things that feel good for me, and also like a little braver in correcting pronouns when people misgender me, because I want to model that for my kid, and model what that looks like. And I think the one last thing is I think I've also gotten a lot more gentle and patient with people in trying to figure this out, because so often when they're trying to gender your kid, they're just trying to connect. They're trying to find something to connect over. So if it's not going to be gender, it's like, oh, like my baby, for instance, they really like, oh, we're not telling the sex or we're not giving them a gender, but they really like looking at light bulbs, or they really like doing this, or like they really like this color, like just giving something to latch onto, and people are pretty much just as happy.
That's a great tip. I think that is something that people don't know what else to ask other than just like, what's the gender of your kid? So giving them options is really helpful. I want to open this up to questions. So I don't know if folks joining in have questions or comments or anything to share, but I'd love to hear like, what's the best way to do it? Like raise your hand or just pop in. I mean, we're a smallish group. We got about 22 people. Because I can keep asking questions as well. I was a journalist for a lot of years.
I can share my thoughts around gender has been, oh, someone's asking if we're going to stop the recording. My thoughts have been really thinking about them in terms of being a social construct, and when is it useful or not. And, just in the same way, it's useful for me to identify as white because it helps identify different power structures that are at play when people are interacting with me. I think that's pretty much the only thing I really think about with gender. I also identify as like pan or bi at this point. And so, I'm probably personally moving towards more of an agender place just because I don't really see the function or the use. I don't know how I would describe gender to anyone at this point. And so I'm like, I don't think I even know what this is. So yeah, that might be changing and evolving for me over time.
Absolutely. I will stop recording now so that we can share openly.